this foramen here. And this is a transverse foramen, so this makes this a cervical vertebrae. Correct, yeah. Getting a little ahead of myself, but all right. Now there are some structures associated with the spinal cord and the brain for that matter. Remember way back like on the second day class we talked about the body cavities. We have the dorsal body cavities and ventral body cavities. The dorsal body cavities contain the brain and spinal cord, cranial cavity, vertebral cavity. And just like the ventral body cavities, the thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic, we have membranes. Now these membranes in the dorsal body cavities are called meninges. Meninx is singular. Should be another N in there. And there's 3 layers to these meninges. We have one layer that's directly on the surface of the spinal cord. That's called the pia mater. That's almost, it would be analogous to the visceral layer, like the visceral peritoneum, or the visceral pericardium, or the visceral pleura that's on the surface of the organ. This pia mater would be analogous to that, because it's right on the surface of the spinal cord. Now, superficial to that, we have kind of a spider web-like membrane called the arachnoid mater, or mater. I'm sure mater means something in Greek or Latin. I don't know why. And then superficial to that, we have a pretty thick is a relative term, but a pretty heavy-duty connective tissue layer called the dura mater. And that is the most superficial. And these are the same things that are part of the brain as well. We have the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia mater as part of the brain as well. And we'll review that next week too. Now, between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater is a space. There's a space in here. It's called the subarachnoid space. Meaning it's deep to the arachnoid mater, and there is a gap in there. There is a space in there. That arachnoid mater is not completely physically attached to the pia mater. It's not like laying 2 pieces of paper on one another. There is a space in there. What happens is the arachnoid mater, and this is where its name comes from, it sends out these little web-like processes from the cells that physically attach to the pia mater. And these processes help to prevent the spinal cord from moving. Now let me explain why. Found in this subarachnoid space is a liquid called cerebrospinal fluid. It surrounds the spinal cord, it surrounds the brain. It's found in the brain as well. In fact, the brain and spinal cord are essentially floating in this cerebrospinal fluid. It renders the brain and spinal cord relatively weightless. And so these little webs that come off of the arachnoid mater and physically attach to the pia mater help to prevent the spinal cord from shifting within that vertebral cavity, within that subarachnoid space. It keeps it stationary. Here's another picture. So here's the dura. It's a big heavy-duty sheath. It goes all the way around like this. So it's this brown color. And this light blue here is the arachnoid. And these little light blue strings are representing those little fibers that come off the arachnoid mater. In fact, these little strings, these on the side here that prevent the spinal cord from swinging side to side, these are called denticulate ligaments. And the pink stuff that you see here is the pia mater, right on the surface of the spinal cord. And the dark blue stuff that's in here, that is the cerebral spinal fluid. We'll talk about the functions of that next week, but besides providing this neutral buoyancy characteristic for the brain and spinal cord, it has some other characteristics as well. Now, I'm not done. I'm going to go right up until 25-2 today. So if we were to look at these layers, if I were to take a pin and insert it through these layers, superficial to deep, I'd go through the dura, the arachnoid, subarachnoid space, and then the pia mater. Now, y'all know what a spinal tap is, right? Okay. A spinal tap is going to draw cerebral spinal fluid from that subarachnoid space. So, in order to do that, that needle has to go through the dura and the arachnoid mater to withdraw that fluid from there. Where do you think they would do one of these spinal taps, or a what was the name I used this earlier, Pat? I forget the name of it. What did I call it?
Lumbar puncture?
Well, thank you. Gave the answer away. Lumbar puncture. Well, not necessarily. Why would they do a spinal tap in the lumbar region as opposed to thoracic or cervical?
Because they spread out farther.
Not necessarily. It's kind of a safety thing.
It's thicker.
What's thicker?
Thicker than the cervical,
What's thicker?
the lumbar, spinal cord. You're trying to get into the spinal cord.
Where does the spinal cord end?
The spinal cord isn't there.
L1, L2, and there's where it ends. The danger with the spinal tap is nicking the spinal cord and damaging those neurons and affecting the signals that are going up and down from the brain. So, if you take the spinal cord out of the equation and do a spinal tap around L4, where there shouldn't be a spinal cord, then you're okay. It's better to nick one of those spinal nerves than it is to nick one of the spinal cord itself. So lumbar puncture is going to take place there for that reason. Now, an epidural anesthetic, that does not involve the dura or the meninges or the cerebrospinal fluid. At least it's not supposed to. If you have a good anesthesiologist, it shouldn't come into play. It's called an epidural because what they're doing is they're injecting the anesthetic into what's called the epidural space. And I assume you had to look at this when you looked at the 5th cervical vertebrae model in lab. No? Well, assume somebody's lying on their belly. This is the spinous process, so this would be pointing up. Epi means up. Dura refers to the dura mater. So epidural space is the space above the dura mater. So what they're going to do then is inject that anesthetic into that space. It will actually numb these nerve roots and prevent nerve signals from being sent down those nerve roots. That's why they don't feel any pain, or you might feel some pressure. I've never had one, but well, you guys can have them too for a variety of reasons. Obviously not for childbirth, but
if they actually puncture the dura, will that then prevent movement?
if they puncture the dura, which is always a risk, if the dura gets punctured, the risk is that cerebrospinal fluid will leak out. Now the problem with that is as I said before, the brain and spinal cord are floating. And if we're losing cerebrospinal fluid, that volume is going to drop. It's going to reduce the buoyancy of the brain and spinal cord, and eventually the brain is going to kind of start to settle on the physical bones inside the skull, and that creates pressure and causes a lot of pain. Yeah. So with an epidural, they should not be going into the dura or the meninges at all. They want to stay right here in that epidural space, but with a spinal tap, a lumbar puncture, yes, they have to get into there. Correct. That's why you have a headache after spinal tap. Right. And if you ever watch House, they're always talking about, well, we can do a spinal tap in the cervical region, but that's dangerous. We can't do that. That's why, because the spinal cord's there. And if they move while they're doing it, anyway. All right. See ya.